Hello, listeners. Today we are gonna start with the speech prepared by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar for the 1936 annual conference of the Jat Path Todak Mandal of Lahore, but not delivered, owing to the cancellation of the conference by the reception committee on the ground that the views expressed in the speech would be unbearable to the conference. Friends, I am really sorry for the members of the Jat Path Todak Mandal who have so very kindly invited me to preside over this conference. I am sure they will be asked many questions for having selected me as the president. The Mandal will be asked to explain as to why it has imported a man from Bombay to preside over a function which is held in Lahore. I believe the Mandal could easily have found someone better qualified than myself to preside on the occasion. I have criticized the Hindus. I have questioned the authority of the Mahatma whom they revere. They hate me. To them I am a snake in their garden. The Mandal will know, in fact, doubt be asked by the politically minded Hindus to explain why it has called me to fill this place of honor. It is an act of great daring. I shall not be surprised if some political Hindus regard it as an insult. This selection of mine cannot certainly because the ordinary religiously minded Hindus. The Mandal may be asked to explain why it has disobeyed the Shastric injunction in selecting the president. According to the Shastras, the Brahmin is appointed to be the Guru for the three Varnas. Varna Nam Brahmano Guru is the direction of the Shastras. The Mandal therefore knows from whom a Hindu should take his lessons and from whom he should not. The Shastras do not permit a Hindu to accept anyone as his Guru merely because he is well versed. This is made very clear by Ramdas, a Brahmin sent from Maharashtra, who is alleged to have inspired Shivaji to establish a Hindu Swaraj. In his Das Bodh, a socio-politico-religious treatise, Antyaja to be our Guru because he is a Pandit, that is learned, and gives an answer in the negative. What replies to give these questions is a matter which I must leave to the Mandal. The Mandal knows best the reasons which led it to travel to Bombay to select a president, to fix upon a man so repugnant to the Hindus and to descend so low in the scale as to select as an Antyaja, an untouchable to address an audience of the Savarnas. As for myself, who will allow me to say that I have accepted the invitation much against my will and also against the will of many of my fellow untouchables. I know that the Hindus are sick of me. I know that I am not a persona grata with them. Knowing all this, I have deliberately kept myself away from them. I have no desire to inflict myself upon them. I have been giving expressions to my views from my own platform. This has already caused a great deal of heartburning and irritation. I have no desire to ascend the platform of the Hindus to do within their side what I have been doing with their hearing. If I am here, it is because of your choice and not because of my wish. Yours is a cause of social reform. That cause has always made an appeal to me, and it is because of this that I felt I ought not to refuse an opportunity of helping the cause, especially when you think that I can help it. Whether what I am going to say today will help you in any way to solve the problem you are grappling with is for you to judge. All I hope to do is to place before you my views on the platform. Second, the path of social reform, like the path to heaven at any rate in India, is striven with many difficulties. Social reform in India has few friends and many critics. The critics fall into two distinct classes. One class consists of political reformers and the other of the socialists. It was at one time recognized that without the social efficiency, no permanent progress in other field of activity was possible, that owing to mischief wrought by the evil customs, Hindu society was not in a state of efficiency, and that ceaseless efforts must be made to eradicate these evils. It was due to the recognition of this fact that the birth of the National Congress was accompanied by the foundation of the Social Conference. While the Congress was concerned with defining the weak points in the political organizations of the country, the Social Conference was engaged in removing the weak points in the social organization of the Hindu society. For some times, the Congress and the Conference worked as the two wings of one common activity, and they held their annual sessions in the same pandal. But soon the two wings developed into two parties, a political reform party and the social reform party, between whom they raised a fierce controversy. The political reform and the political reform party supported the National Congress, and the social reform party supported the Social Conference. The two bodies thus become the two hostile camps. The point at issue was whether social reform should precede political reform. For a decade, the forces were evenly balanced and the battle was fought without victory to either side. It was, however, evident that the fortunes of the Social Conference were ebbing fast. The gentlemen who presided over the sessions of the Social Conference lamented that the majority of the educated Hindus were for political advancement and indifferent to social reform, and that while the number of those who attended the Congress was very large, and the number who did not attend but who sympathized with it even larger, the number of those who attended the Social Conference was very much smaller. This indifference, this thinning of its ranks, was soon followed by active hostility from the politicians. Under the leadership of the late Mr. Tilak, the courtesy with which the Congress allowed the Social Conference the use of its pandal was withdrawn, and the spirit of enmity went to such a pitch that when the Social Conference desired to erect its own pandal, a threat to burn the pandal was held out by its opponents. Thus, in course of time, the party in favor of the political reform won, and the Social Conference vanished and was forgotten. The speech delivered by the Mr. W.C. Banerjee in 1892 at Allahabad as the president of the 8th session of the Congress sounds like a funeral oration at the death of the Social Conference, and is so typical of the Congress attitude that I venture to quote from it the following extract. Mr. Banerjee said, "I for one, who have no patience with those who say we shall not be fit for political reform until we reform our social system. I fail to see any connection between the two. Are we not fit for political reform because our widows remain unmarried and our girls are given in marriage earlier than in other countries? Because our wives and daughters do not drive about with us visiting our friends? Because we do not send our daughters to Oxford and Cambridge?" I have stated the case for political reform as put by Mr. Banerjee. There were many who are happy that the victory went to the Congress, but those who believe in the importance of the social reform may ask, is the argument such that as that of the Mr. Banerjee final? Does it prove that the victory went to those who were in the right? Does it prove conclusively that the social reform has no bearing on political reform? It will help us to understand the matter if I state the other side of the case. I will draw upon the treatment of the untouchables of my facts. Under the rules of the Peshwas in the Maratha country, the untouchable was not allowed to use the public streets. If a Hindu was coming along least he should pollute the Hindu by his shadow. The untouchable was required to have a black thread either on his wrist or in his neck as a sign or a mark to prevent the Hindus from getting themselves polluted by his hands through mistake. In Pune, the capital of the Peshwa, the untouchable was required to carry, strung from his waist, a broom to sweep away from behind the dust he treaded on, lest a Hindu walking on the same should be polluted. In Pune, the untouchable was required to carry an earthen pot hung in his neck wherever he went, for holding his feet, lest his feet falling on earth should pollute a Hindu who might unknowingly happened to tread on it. Let me take one more recent fact. The tyranny practiced by the Hindus upon the Baliyas and untouchable committee in the central India will serve my purpose. You will find a report of this in the Times of India of 4th January 1928. The correspondent of the Times of India reported that the high caste Hindus, that is the Kalotas, Rajputs, Brahmins, including the Patels and the Patwaris of the village of the Kanaria, Bicholis Hafsi, Bicholi Mardana, and of about 15 other villages in the Indore district of the Indore state, informed that the Baliyas of their respective villages that if they wish to live among them, they must conform to the following rules. First, Baliyas must not wear gold lace bordered pugris. Second, they must not wear dhotis with colored or fancy borders. Third, they must convey intimation of the death of any Hindu to relatives of the deceased, no matter how far away these relatives may be living. Fourth, in all Hindu marriages, Baliyas must play music before the processions and during the marriage. Fifth, Baliya women must not wear gold or silver ornaments. They must not wear fancy gowns or jackets. Sixth, Baliya women must attend all cases of confinement of Hindu women. Seventh, Baliyas must render services without demanding the remuneration and must accept whatever a Hindu is pleased to give. 8. If the Baliyas do not agree to abide by this term, they must clear out of the villages. The Baliyas refused to comply, and the Hindu element proceeded against them. Baliyas were not allowed to get water from the village wells. They were not allowed to get or to let go their cattle to graze. Baliyas were prohibited from passing through land owned by a Hindu, so that if the field of the Baliya was surrounded by the fields, by the fields, the Hindus also let their cattle graze down the fields of the Baliyas. The Baliyas submitted petitions to the Darbar against these persecutions, but as they could get no timely relief and the operation continues, hundreds of Baliyas with their wives and children were obliged to abandon their homes in which their ancestors lived for generations and to migrate to adjoining states like to villages in Dahar, Devas, Bagli, Bhopal, Gwalior and other states. What happened to them in their new homes may for the present be left out of our consideration. The incident at Kavitha in Gujarat happened only last year. The Hindus of the Kavitha ordered the untouchables not to insist upon sending their children to the common village school maintained by the government. What sufferings the untouchables of the Kavitha had to undergo for daring to exercise a civic right against the wishes of the Hindus is too well known to need detailed descriptions. Another instance occurred in the village of the Zanu in the Ahmedabad district of Gujarat. In November 1935, some untouchable women of well-to-do families started fetching water in metal pots. The Hindus looked upon the use of the metal pots by untouchables as an affront to their dignity and assaulted the untouchable women for their impudence. A most recent event is reported from the village Chakwara in Jaipur district, in fact in Jaipur state. It seems from the reports that have appeared in the newspaper that an untouchable of Chakwara who had returned from a pilgrimage had arranged to give a dinner to his fellow untouchables of the village as an act of religious pity. The host desired to treat the guests to a sumptuous meal and the items served including ghee, that is a butter also. But while the assembly of the untouchables were engaged in partaking of the food, the Hindus in their hundreds, armed with lathis, rushed to the scene, despoiled the food and belabored the untouchables who left the food they were served with and ran away for their lives. And why was there a murderous assault committed on defenseless untouchables? The reason given is that the untouchable hosts were impudent enough to serve ghee and his untouchable guests were foolish enough to test it. Ghee is undoubtedly a luxury for the rich, but no one would think that consumption of ghee was a mark of a high social status. The Hindus of the Chakwara thought otherwise, and in righteous indignation avenged themselves for the wrong done to them by the untouchables, who insulted them to treating ghee as an item of their food which they ought to have known could not be theirs, consistently with the dignity of the Hindus. This means that an untouchable must not use ghee even if he can afford to buy it. Since it is an act of arrogance towards the Hindu, this happened on or about the 1st April 1936. Having stated the facts, let me now state the case for social reform. In doing this, I will follow Mr. Banerjee as nearly as I can and ask the politically minded Hindus, are you fit for political power even though you do not allow a large class of your own countrymen like the untouchables to use public schools? Are you fit for the political power even though you do not allow them the use of public wells? Are you fit for the political power even though you do not allow them to use the public streets? Are you fit for the political power even though you do not allow them to wear what apparel or ornaments they like? Are you fit for the political power even though you do not allow them to eat any food they like? I can ask a string of such questions, but this will suffice. I wonder that what would have been the reply of Mr. Banerjee. I am sure no sensible man will have the courage to give an affirmative answer. Every congressman who repeats the dogma of the mill that one country is not fit to rule another country must admit that one class is not fit to rule another class. How is it then that the Social Reform Party lost the battle? To understand this correctly, it is necessary to take note of this kind of social reform which the reformers were agitating for. In this connection, it is necessary to make a distinction between social reform in the sense of the reform of the Hindu family and the social reform in the sense of the reorganization and reconstruction of the Hindu society. The former has relation to widow remarriage, child marriage, etc., while the latter relates to the abolition of the caste system. The Social Conference was a body which mainly concerned itself with the reform of the high caste Hindu family. It consisted mostly of the enlightened high caste Hindus who did not feel the necessity for agitating for the abolition of the caste or had not the courage to agitate for it. They felt quite naturally a greater urge to remove such evils as enforced widowhood, child marriages, etc., evils which prevailed among them and which were personally felt by them. They did not understand, in fact, they did not stand up for the reform of the Hindu society. The battle that was fought centered round the question of the reform of the family. It did not relate to the social reform in the sense of the breakup of the caste system. It was never put an issue by the reformers. That is the reason why the Social Reform Party lost. I am aware that this argument cannot alter the fact that the political reform did in fact gain precedence over social reform. But the argument has this much value, if not more. It explains why social reform lost the battles. It also helps us to understand how limited was the victory which the political reform party obtained over the social reform party, and that the view that the social reform need not precede political reform is a view which may stand only when by the social reform is meant the reform of the family. That political reform cannot with impunity take precedence over the social reform in the sense of reconstruction of society is a thesis which I am sure cannot be controverted. That the makers of the political constitutions must take account of the social forces is a fact which is recognized by no less a person than the Ferdinand Lassalle, the friend and the co-worker of the Karl Marx. In addressing a Prussian audience in 1862, Lassalle said, "The constitutional questions are in the first instance not questions of the right but questions of might. The actual constitution of a country has its existence only in the actual condition of force which exists in the country. Hence, political constitutions have value and permanence only when they accurately express those conditions of force who or which exist in practice within a society. But it is not necessary to go to Prussia. And there is evidence at home. What is the significance of the communal award? With its allocation of a political power, it defines proportions to diverse class and communities. In my view, its significance lies in this, that the political constitution must take note of social organization. It shows that the politicians who denied that the social problem in India had any bearing on the political problem were forced to reckon with the social problem in devising the constitution. The communal award is so to say the nemesis following upon the indifference and neglect of social reform. It is a victory for the social reform party, which allows that though defeated they were in the right in insisting upon the importance of social reform. Many I know will not accept this finding. The view is current and it is a pleasant to believe in it, that the communal communal award is unnatural, and that it is the result of an unholy alliance between the minorities and the bureaucracy. I do not wish to rely on the communal award as the evidence. Let us turn to Ireland. What does the history of the Irish Home Rule show? It is well known that in the course of the negotiation between the representative of the Ulsters and the Southern Ireland, Mr. Redmond, the representative Ireland in order to bring Ulster in a Home Rule constitution common to the whole of Ireland, said to the representation of the Ulsters, "Ask any political safeguards you like, and you shall have them." What was the reply that Ulstermen gave? Their reply was, "Damn your safeguards, we do not want to be ruled by you on any terms." People who blame the minorities in India ought to consider what would have happened to the political aspirations of the majority if the minorities had taken the attitude which Ulster took. Judged by the attitude of the Ulster to Irish Home Rule, is it nothing that the minorities agree to be ruled by the majority, which has not shown much sense of statesmanship, provided some safeguards were devised from them? But this is the only incidental. The main question is, why did Ulster take this attitude? The only answer I can give is that there was a social problem between the Ulster and the Southern Ireland, and the problem between the Catholics and the Protestants, essentially a problem of caste. That Home Rule in Ireland would be a Rome Rule was the way in which the Ulstermen had framed their answer. But that is only another way of stating that it was the social problem of caste between the Catholics and the Protestants which prevented the solutions of the political problems. This evidence again is sure to be challenged. It will urge that here to the hand of the imperialists was at work. But my resources are not exhausted. I will give evidence from the history of Rome. Here no one can say that any evil genius was at work. Anyone who has studied the history of Rome will know that the Republican Constitution of Rome bore marks having strong resemblance to the communal award. When the kingship in when the kingship in Rome was abolished, the kingly power of the imperium was divided between the consuls and the pontifex maximus. In the consuls was vested the secular authority of the king, while the latter took over the religious authority of the king. This republican constitution had provided that of the two consuls, one was to be the patrician and the other is the plebeian. The same constitution had also provided that of the priests under the pontifex maximus, half were to be the plebeians and the other half patricians. Why is that the Republican Constitution of Rome had these provisions which, as I said, resemble so strongly the provisions of the communal award? The only answer one can get is that the constitution of the Republican Rome had to take account of the social division between the patricians and the plebeians, who form the two distinct castes. To sum up, let political reformers turn to any directions they like. They will find that in the making of the constitution they cannot ignore the problem arising out of the prevailing social order. The illustration which I have taken in support of the propositions that social and the religious problems have a bearing on political constitution seem to be too particular. Perhaps they are, but it should not be supposed that the bearing of the one on the other is limited. On the other hand, one can say that the religiously speaking history bears out the proposition that political revolutions have always been preceded by the social and the religious revolutions. The religious reformation started by the Luther was the precursor of the political emancipation of the European people. In England, Puritanism led to the establishment of the political liberty. Puritanism founded the New World. It was Puritanism which won the war of the American independence, and the Puritanism was the religious movement. The same is true of the Muslim empire. Before the Arabs became a political power, they had undergo a thorough religious revolution started by the Prophet Muhammad. Even Indian history supports the same conclusion. The political revolutions led by the Chandragupta was preceded by the religious and the social revolutions of Buddha. The political revolution led by the Shivaji was preceded by the religious and the social reform brought about by the saints of Maharashtra. The political revolutions of the Sikhs was preceded by the religious and the social revolution led by the Guru Nanak. It is unnecessary to add more illustrations. This will suffice to show that the emancipation of the mind and the soul is necessary preliminary for the political expansion of the people. Third, let me now turn to the socialists. Can the socialist ignore the problem arising out of the social order? The socialists of India, following their fellows in Europe, are seeking to apply the economic interpretation of history to the facts of India. They propound that man is an economic creature, that his activities and the aspirations are bound by the economic facts, that property is the only source of power. They therefore preach that the political and the social reforms are but gigantic illusions, and that economic reform by equalization of the property must have precedence over every other kind of reform. One may join issue on every one of those premises on which rests the socialist case for economic reform having priority over every other kind of the reform. One for economic reform having priority over every other kind of the reform. One may contend that the economic motive is not only the motive by which man is acquitted, that the economic power is the only kind of the power no student of human society can accept, that the social status of an individual by itself often becomes a source of power, and the authority is made clear by the sway which the Mahatmas have held over the common man. Why do millionaires in India obey penniless sadhus and fakirs? Why do millions of paupers in India sell their trifling trinkets which constitute their only wealth and go to Banaras and Mecca? That religion is the source of power is illustrated by the history of the India, where the priest holds a sway over the common man, often greater than the magistrate, and where everything, even such things are as strikes and elections, so easily take the religious turn and can easily be a religious twist. Take the case of the plebeians of Rome as a further illustration of the power of the religion over man. It throws great light on this point. The plebs had fought for a share in the supreme executive under the Roman Republic and had secured the appointment of the plebeian council, elected by a separate electorate constituted by the Comitia Centurita, which was an assembly of the plebeians. They wanted a council of their own because they felt that the patrician councils, in fact, patrician councils used to discriminate against the plebeians in carrying on the administration. They had apparently obtained a great gain because under the Republican Constitution of Rome, one consul had the power of vetoing an act of the other consul, but did they in fact gain anything? The answer to this question must not be in the negative. The plebeians never could get a plebeian consul who could be said to be a strong man and who could act independently of the patrician council. In the ordinary course of things, the plebeians should have got a strong plebeian council in view of the fact that his election was to be by a separate electorate of plebeians. The question is, why did they fail in getting a strong plebeian to officiate as their consul? The answer to this question reveals the dominion which religious exercises over the minds of men. It was an accepted creed of the whole Roman populace that no official could enter upon the duties of his office unless the oracle of Delphi declared that he was acceptable to the goddesses. The priests who were in charge of the temple of the goddesses of Delphi were all patricians. Whenever therefore the plebeians elected as a consul who was known to be a strong party man opposed to the patrician or communal, to use the term that is current in India, the oracle invariably declared that he was not acceptable to the goddesses. This is how the plebeians were cheated out of their rights. But what is worthy of note is that the plebeians permitted themselves to be thus cheated because they too, like the patricians, held firmly the belief that the approval of the goddesses was a condition precedent to the taking charge by an official of his duty, and that election by the people was not enough. If the plebeian had contended that election was enough and that the approval by the goddesses was not necessary, they would have derived the fullest benefit from the political right which they had obtained, but they did not. They agreed to elect another, less suitable to themselves but more suitable to the goddesses, which in fact meant more amenable to the patricians. Rather than give up religion, the plebeians give up the material gain for which they had fought so hard. Does this not show that the religion can be a source of power as great as money, if not greater? The fallacy of the socialists lie in supposing that because in the present stage of the European society property as a source of power is predominant, that the same is true of India, or that the same was true of Europe in the past. Religion, social status and the property are all sources of power and authority, which one man has to control the liberty of another. One is predominant at one stage, the other is predominant at another stage. That is the only difference. If liberty is the ideal, if liberty means the destruction of the dominion which one man holds over another, then obviously it cannot be insisted upon that the economic power and dominion is at any given time or any in any given society, social and the religious. Then social reform and the religious reform must be accepted as the necessary short of reform. One can thus attack the doctrine of the economic interpretation of Hindu, in fact history adopted by the socialists of India. But I recognize that the economic interpretation of history is not necessary for the validity of the socialist contention that equalization of property is the only real reform and that it must precede everything else. However, what I like to ask the socialist is this: can you have economic reform without first bringing about a reform of the social order? The socialists of India do not seem to have considered this question. I do not wish to do them an injustice. I give below a quotation from a letter which a prominent socialist wrote a few days ago to a friend of mine, in which he said, "I do not believe that we can build up a free society in India so long as there is a trace of this ill treatment and suppression of one class by another. Believing as I do in a socialist ideal, inevitably I believe in perfect equality in the treatment of various classes and groups. I think that the socialism offers the only true remedy for this as well as the other problems." Now the question that I like to ask is it enough for a socialist to say, "I believe in perfect equality in the treatment of the various classes"? To say that such a belief is enough is to disclose a complete lack of understanding. Complete lack of understanding of what is involved in the socialism. If socialism is a practical program and is not merely an ideal, distant and far off, the question for a socialist is not whether he believes in equality. The question for him is whether he minds a matter of principle, and thus, I'm repeating once again. The question for him is whether he minds one class ill-treating and suppressing another class as a matter of system, as a matter of principle, thus allow tyranny and oppression to continue to divide one class into another. Let me analyze the factors that are involved in the realization of socialism in order to explain fully my point. Now, it is obvious that the economic reform contemplated by the socialists cannot come about unless there is a revolution resulting in the seizure of power. That the seizure of power must be by a proletariat. The first question I ask is, will the proletariat of India combine to bring about this revolution? What will move men to such an action? It seems to me that the other things become equal. In fact, it seems to me that other things being equal, the only thing that will move one man to take such an action is the feeling that the other man with whom he is acting are acquitted by feeling of equality and fraternity, and above all of justice. Men will not join in a revolution for the equalization of property unless they know that after the revolution is achieved, they will treat it equally and that there will be no discrimination of caste, creed. The assurance of the socialist leading the revolution that he does not believe in caste, I am sure, will not suffice. The assurance must be the assurance proceeding from which deeper foundation, namely the mental attitude of the competitors towards one another in their spirit of personal equality and fraternity. Can it be said that the proletariat of India, poor as it is, recognize no distinction except that of the rich and that of the poor? Can it be said that the poor in India recognize no such distinctions of caste or creed, high or low? If the fact is that they do, What unity of front can be expected from such a proletariat in its action against the rich? How? In fact, how can there be a revolution if the proletariat cannot present a united front? Suppose, for the sake of the argument, that by some freak of fortune a revolution does take place and the socialists come in power, will they not have to deal with the problems created by the particular social order prevalent in India? I cannot see how a socialist state in India can function for a second without having a grapple with the problems created by the prejudices which make Indian people observe the distinctions of high and low, clean and unclean. If socialists are not to be content with the mouthing of fine phrases, if the socialists wish to make socialism a definite reality, then they must recognize that the problem of social reform is fundamental and that for them there is no escape from it. That the social order prevalent in India is a matter which a socialist must deal with, that unless he does so, he cannot achieve his revolution, and that if he does not achieve it as a result of good fortune, he will have to grapple with it if he wishes to realize his ideal is a proposition which in my opinion is incontrovertible. He will be compelled to take account of caste after revolution if he does not take account of it before revolution. This is only another way of saying that, turn in any direction you like, caste is the monster that crosses your path. You cannot have political reform, you cannot have economic reform unless you kill this monster. Fourth, it is a pity that caste even today has its defender. The defenses are many. It is defended on the ground that the caste system is but another name for division of labor, and if division of labor is a necessary feature of every civilized society, then it is argued that there is nothing wrong in the caste system. Now, the first thing is to be urged against this view is that the caste system is not merely division of labor, it is also a division of laborers. Civilized society undoubtedly needs division of labors, but in no civilized society is division of labors accompanied by these unnatural divisions of labors into a watertight compartments. Caste system is not merely a divisions of labors, which is quite different from divisions of labor. It is an hierarchy in which the divisions of labors are graded one above the other. In no other country is the division of labor accompanied by this gradation of laborers. There is also a third point to criticism against this view of the caste system. This division of labor is not spontaneous. It is not based on the natural aptitudes. Social and individual efficiency requires us to develop the capacity of an individual to the point of competency to choose and to make his own career. This principle is violated in the caste system in so far as it involves an attempt to appoint tasks to individuals in advance, selected not on the basis of trained original capacities but on that of the social status of the parents. Look at from another point of view, the stratification of occupations, which is the result of the caste system, is positively pernicious. Industry is never static. It undergoes rapid and abrupt changes. With such changes, an individual must be free to change his occupation. Without such freedom to adjust himself to changing circumstances, it would be impossible for him to gain his livelihood. Now, the caste system will not allow the Hindus to take to occupations where they wanted if they do not belong to them by heredity. If a Hindu is seen to starve rather than take to new occupations not assigned to his caste, the reason is to found in the caste system. By not permitting readjustment of the occupations, caste becomes a direct cause of much of the unemployment we see in the country. As a form of a division of labor, the caste system suffers from another serious defect. The division of labor brought about by the caste system is not a division based on choice. Individual sentiments, individual preferences has no place in it. It is based on the dogma of the predestination. Consideration of the social efficiency will compel us to recognize that the greatest evil in the industrial system is not so much poverty and the suffering that it involves as the fact that so many persons have callings which make no appeal to those who are engaged in them. Such callings constantly provoke one to aversion, ill will, and desire to evade. There are many occupations in India which, on account of the fact that they are regarded as degraded by the Hindus, provoke those who are engaged in them to aversions. There is a constant desire to evade and escape from such occupations which arises slowly, in fact solely, because of the blighting effect which they produce upon those who follow them, owing to the slight and stigma cast upon them by the Hindu religion. What efficiency can there be in a caste, in fact in a system under which neither men's heart nor their mind are in their work? As an economic organization, caste is therefore a harmful institution in as much as it involves the subordination of man's natural powers and inclination to the exigencies of social rules. Fifth, somehow drug a biological trench in defense of the caste system. It is said that the object of a caste was to preserve purity of race and the purity of blood. Now, ethnologists are of opinion that men of a pure race exist nowhere and that there has been a mixture of all races in all parts of the world. Especially is this the case with the people of India. Mr. D.R. Bhandarkar, in his paper on foreign elements in all the Hindu population, has stated that there is hardly a class or caste in India which has not a foreign strain in it. There is an admixture of alien blood not only among the warrior classes, the Rajputs and the Marathas, but also among the Brahmins, who are under the happy delusions that they are free from all the foreign elements. The caste system cannot be said to have grown as means of preventing the admixtures of races or as means of maintaining purity of blood.
As a matter of a fact, caste system came into being long after the different races of India had commingled in blood and culture. To hold that distinctions of caste or really distinctions of race, and to treat different castes as though they were so many different races, in a gross perversions of facts. What racial affinity is there between the Brahmin of the Punjab and the Brahmin of the Madras? What racial affinity is there between the untouchables of Bengal and the untouchable of Madras? What racial difference is there between the Brahmin of the Punjab and the Chamar of the Punjab? What racial difference is there between the Brahmin of the Madras and the Pariah of the Madras? The Brahmin of the Punjab is racially of the same stock as the Chamar of the Punjab, and the Brahmin of the Madras is of the same race as that of the Pariah of Madras. Caste system does not demarcate racial divisions. Caste system is the social divisions of the people of the same race. Assuming it, however, to be a case of racial divisions, one may ask, what harm could there be if a mixture of races and of bloods were permitted to take place in India by intermarriages between the different castes? Men are no doubt divided into the animals by so deep distinctions that science recognizes men and animals as two distinct species. But even scientists who believe in purity of races do not assert that the different races constitute different species of men. They are only varieties of one and the same species. As such, they can interbreed and produce an offspring which is capable of breeding and which is not sterile. An immense lot of nonsense is talked about heredity and eugenics in defense of the caste system. Few would object to the caste system if it was in accord with the basic principle of eugenics, because few objects few can object to the improvement of the race by judicious mating, but one fails to understand how the caste system secures judicious mating. So caste system is a negative thing. It merely prohibits person belonging to the different caste from intermarrying. It is not a positive method of selecting which two among a given caste would marry. If caste is eugenic in origin, then the origin of the subcaste must also be eugenic. But can anyone seriously maintain that the origin of the subcaste is eugenic? I think it would be absurd to contend for such a proposition, and for a very obvious reason. If caste means race, then difference of subcaste cannot mean difference of race, because of the subcaste becomes ex hypothesia subdivisions of one and the same race. Consequently, the bar against intermarrying and interdining between the subcaste cannot be for the purpose of maintaining purity of race or of blood. If subcaste cannot be eugenic in origin, there cannot be any substance in the contention that the caste is eugenic in origin. Again, if caste is eugenic in origin, one can understand the bar against intermarriage. But what is the purpose of the interdict? Interdict placed on interdining between the caste and the subcaste alike. Interdining cannot affect, in fact, interdining cannot infect blood, and therefore cannot be the cause either of the improvement or the deterioration of the race. This shows that caste has no scientific origin, and that those who are attempting to give it an eugenic basis are trying to support by science what is grossly unscientific. Even today, eugenics cannot become a practical possibility unless we have definite knowledge regarding the laws of heredity. Professor Batson, in his Mendel's principle of heredity, says there is nothing in the descent of the higher mental qualities to suggest that they follow any single system of transmission. It is like that both they and the more marked developments of physical powers results rather from the coincidence of the numerous factors than from the possessions of any one genetic element. To argue that the caste system was eugenic in its conception is to attribute to the forefathers of the present day Hindus a knowledge of heredity which even the modern scientists do not possess. A tree should be judged by the fruits it yields. If caste is eugenic, what sort of a race of men it should have produced? Physically speaking, the Hindus are a C3 people. They are a race of pygmies and dwarfs, stunted in stature and wanting in stamina. It is a nation 9 by halves, in fact 9 by tenths, of which is declared to be unfit for military services. This shows that the caste system does not embody the eugenics of the modern scientists. It is social system which embodies the arrogance and selfishness of a preserved section of the Hindus who were superior enough in social status to set it in a fashion and who had authority to force it on their inferiors. Sixth, caste does not result in economic efficiency. Caste cannot and has not improved the race. Caste has, however, done one thing: it has completely disorganized and demoralized the Hindus. The first and the foremost thing that must be recognized is that the Hindu society is a myth. The name of Hindu is itself a foreign origin. It was given by the Mohammedans to the natives for the purpose of distinguishing themselves. It does not occur in any Sanskrit work prior to the Mohammedan invasion. They did not feel the necessity of a common name because they had no conceptions of their having constituted a community. Hindu society as such does not exist. It is only a collection of the caste. Each caste is conscious of its existence. Its survival is the be all and end all of its existence. Castes do not even form a federation. A caste has no feeling that is affiliated to other castes except when there is a Hindu-Muslim riot. On all other occasions, each caste endures to segregate itself and to distinguish itself from other castes. Each caste not only dines among them itself, and marries among itself, but each caste prescribes its own distinctive dress. What other explanation can there be of the innumerable styles of dress worn by the men and women of India, which so amuse the tourist? Indeed, the ideal Hindu must be like a rat living in his own hole, refusing to have any contact with others. There is an utter lack among the Hindus of what the socialists call conscious of mind. In fact, the consciousness of mind, consciousness of kind. There is no Hindu consciousness of kind. In every Hindu, the consciousness that exists in the consciousness of his caste. That is the reason. That is the reason why the Hindu cannot be said to form a society or a nation. There are, however, many Indians whose patriotism does not permit them to admit that Indians are not a nation, that they are only an amorphous mass of people. They have insisted that underlying the apparent diversity, there is a fundamental unity which marks the life of the Hindus, in as much as there is a similarity of habits and customs, beliefs and thoughts which obtain all over the continent of India. Similarly, in habits and customs, beliefs and thoughts, there is, but one cannot accept the conclusion that therefore the Hindus constitute a society. To do so is to misunderstand the essentials which go to make up a society. Men do not become a society by living in a physical proximity any more than a man ceases to be a member of his society by living so many miles away from other men. Secondly, similarity in habits and customs, beliefs and thoughts is not enough to constitute men into society. Things may be passed physically from one to another like bricks. In the same way, habits and customs, beliefs and thoughts of one group may be taken over by another group, and there may thus appear a similarity between the two. Culture spreads by diffusion, and that is why one finds similarity between various primitive tribes in the matter of their habits and customs, beliefs and thoughts, although they do not live in proximity. But no one could say that because there was this similarity, the primitive tribes constituted one society. This is because similarity in certain things is not enough to constitute a society. Men constitute a society because they have things which they possess in common. To have similar things is totally different from possessing things in common. And the only way by which men can come to possess things in common with one another is by being in communication with one another. This is merely another way of saying that the society continues to exist by communication, indeed in communication. To make it concrete, it is not enough if men act in a way which agrees with the acts of others. Parallel activity, even if similar, is not sufficient to bind men into society. This is proved by the fact that the festivals observed by the different castes among the Hindus are the same. Yet, their parallel performances of the similar festivals by the different castes have not bound them into one integral whole. For that purpose, what is necessary is for a man to share and participate in the common activity so that the same emotions are aroused in him that animate the other, making the individual a sharp sharer or a partner in the associated activity, so that he feels its success as his success, its failures as his failures, is the real thing that binds men and makes a society of them. The caste system prevents common activity, and by preventing common activity, it has prevented the Hindus from becoming a society with a unified life and consciousness of its own being. 7th, the Hindus often complain of the isolation and the exclusiveness of a gang or a clique and blame them for anti-social spirit. But they conveniently forget that this anti-social spirit is the worst feature of their own caste system. One caste enjoys singing a hymn of hate against another caste as much as the Germans did in singing their hymns of hate against the English during the last war. The literature of the Hindus is full of caste genealogies in which an attempt is made to give a noble origin to one caste and ignoble origin to other caste. The Sahyadri Kand is a notorious instance of this caste of literature. This antisocial spirit is not confined to caste alone. It has gone deeper and has poisoned the mutual relations of the subcaste as well. In my province, the Golak Brahmins, the Devrukha Brahmins, the Karada Brahmins, the Palse Brahmins and the Chitpavan Brahmins all claim to be the subdivisions of the Brahmin caste. But the antisocial spirit that prevails between them is quite as marked and quite as virulent as the antisocial spirit that prevails between them and other non-Brahmin castes. There is nothing strange in this. An antisocial spirit is found wherever one group has interests of its own, which shut it out from full interaction with other groups, so that its prevailing purpose is protection of what it has got. This antisocial spirit, this spirit of protecting its own interest is as much a marked feature of the different castes in their isolation from one another as it is of the nation in their isolation. The Brahmin's primary concern is to protect his interests against those of the non-Brahmins, and the non-Brahmins' primary concern is to protect their interests against those of the Brahmins. The Hindus, therefore, are not merely an assortment of the castes, but they are so many varying groups, each living for itself and for its selfish ideal. There is another feature of the caste which is deplorable. The ancestors of the present day English fought on one side and the other in the wars of the Roses and the Cromwellian War, but the descendants of those who fought on the one side do not bear any animosity, any grudge against the descendants of those who fought on the other side. The feud is forgotten. But the present day non-Brahmins cannot forgive the present day Brahmins for the insult their ancestors gave to Shivaji. The present day Kayasthas will not forgive the present day Brahmins for the infamy cast upon their forefathers by the forefathers of the latter. To what is this difference due? Obviously to the caste system. The existence of the caste and caste consciousness has served to keep the memory of the past feuds between the castes green and has prevented solidarity. 8. The recent discussions on the recent discussion about the excluded and the partially included areas has served to draw attention to the position of what are called the aboriginal tribes in India. They number about 13 millions if not more. Apart from the question whether their exclusions from the new constitution is proper or improper, the fact still remains that these aborigines have remained in their primitive uncivilized state in a land which boasts of a civilization thousands of years old. Not only are they not civilized, but some of them follow pursuits which have led to their being classified as criminals. 13 millions of people living in the midst of civilization are still in a savage state and are leading the life of hereditary criminals. But the Hindus have never felt ashamed of it. This is a phenomenon which in my view is quite unparalleled. What is the cause of this shameful state of affairs? Why has no attempt been made to civilize these aborigines and to lead them to take to a more honorable way of making a living? The Hindus will probably seek to account for this savage state of the aborigines by attributing to them congenital stupidity. They will probably not admit that the aborigines have remained savages because they had made no effort to civilize them, to give them medical aid, to reform them, to make them good citizens. But supposing a Hindu wish to do what the Christian missionary is doing for these aborigines, could he have done it? I submit not. Civilizing the aborigines means adopting them as your own, living in their midst and cultivating fellow feeling, in short, loving them. How is it feel for a Hindu to do this? His whole life is one anxious efforts to preserve his caste. Caste is his precious possessions which he must save at any cost. He cannot consent to lose it by establishing contact with the aborigines, the remnants of the hateful Anaryas of the Vedic days. Not that a Hindu could not be taught the sense of duty to fallen humanity. But the trouble is that no amount of the sense of duty can enable him to overcome his duty to preserve his caste. Caste is therefore the real explanation as to why the Hindu has let the savage remain a savage in the midst of his civilization, without blushing or without feeling any sense of remorse or repentance. The Hindu has not realized that these aborigines are a source of potential danger. If these savages remain savages, they may not do any harm to the Hindus. But if they are reclaimed by non-Hindus and converted through their faiths, they will swell. They will swell the ranks of the enemies of the Hindus. If this happens, the Hindus will have to thank himself and his caste system. 9th. Not only has the Hindus made no effort for the humanitarian cause of civilizing the savages, but the higher caste Hindus have deliberately prevented the lower caste who are within the pale of Hinduism from rising to them cultural level of the higher caste. I will give two instances, one of the Sonars and the other of the Pathare Prabhus. Both are communities quite well known in Maharashtra. Like the rest of the communities desiring to raise their status, these two communities were at one time endeavoring to adopt some of the ways and habits of the Brahmins. The Sonars were styling themselves uh, Daivadnya Brahmins and were wearing their dhotis with folds on and using the word Namaskar for salutation. Both the folded way of wearing the dhoti and the namaskar were special to the Brahmins. The Brahmins did not like this imitation and this attempt by Sonars to pass off as Brahmins. Under the authority of the Peshwas, that the Brahmins successfully put down this attempt on the part of the Sonars to adopt the ways of the Brahmins. They even got the president of the councils of the East India Company's settlement in Bombay to issue a prohibitory order against the Sonars residing in Bombay. At one time, the Patre Prabhus had widow remarriage as a custom of their caste. This custom of Hindu remarriage was later on looked upon as a mark of social inferiority by some members of the caste, especially because it was contrary to the custom prevalent among the Hindus. With the object of raising the status of their community, some Patre Prabhus sought to stop this practice of widow remarriage that was prevalent in their caste. In fact, the community was divided into two camps, one for and another against the innovation. The Peshwas took the side of those in favor of the widow remarriage and thus virtually prohibited the Patre Prabhus from following the ways of the Brahmin. The Hindus criticized the Mohammedans for having spread their religion by the use of the sword. They also ridiculed Christianity on the score of the Inquisition. But really speaking, who is better and more worthy of our respect? The Mohammedans and Christians who attempted to thrust down the throats of unwilling peoples what they regarded as necessary for their salvation, or the Hindu who would not spread the light, who would endeavor to keep others in darkness, who would not consent to share his intellectual and social inheritance with those who are already and willing to make it a part of their own makeup. I have no hesitations in saying that if the Mohammedans has been cruel, the Hindu has been mean, and meanness in is worse than cruelty. 10th. Whether the Hindu religion was or was not a missionary religion has been controversial issue. Some hold the view that it was never a missionary religion. Others hold that it was. That the Hindu religion was once a missionary religion must be admitted. It could not have spread over the face of India. If it was not a missionary religion, that today it is not a missionary religion is also a fact which must be accepted. The question therefore is not whether or not the Hindu religion was a missionary religion. The real question is why did the Hindu religion cease to be a missionary religion? My answer is this: the Hindu religion ceased to be a missionary religion when the caste system grew up among the Hindus. Caste is inconsistent with conversion. Inculcation of the beliefs and the dogmas is not only the problem that is involved in the conversion. To find a place for the convert in the social life of the community is another and a much more important problem that arises in connection with conversions. That problem is where to place the convert in what caste. It is a problem which must baffle every Hindu wishing to make aliens convert to his religion. Unlike the club, the membership of a caste is not open to all and sundry. The law of the caste confines its membership to persons born in the caste. Castes are autonomous and there is no authority anywhere to compel a caste to admit a newcomer of its social life. Hindu society being a collection of castes and each caste being a closed corporation, there is no place for a convert. Thus, it is the caste which has prevented the Hindus from expanding and from absorbing other religious communities. So long as the caste remain, Hindu religion cannot be made a missionary religion, and Suddhi will be bought a folly and futility. 11th, the reason which have made Suddhi impossible for Hindus are also responsible for making the Sanghatan impossible. The idea underlying Sanghatan is to remove from the mind of the Hindu that timidity and cowardice which so painfully make him off from the Mohammedan and the Sikh, and which have led him to adopt and low ways of treachery and cunning for protecting himself. The question naturally arises: from where does the Sikh or the Mohammedan derive his strength, which makes him brave and fearless? I am sure it is not due to the relative superiority of physical strength, diet or drill. It is due to the strength arising out of the feeling that all Sikhs will come to the rescue of a Sikh when he is in danger, that all Mohammedans will rush to save the Muslims if he is attacked. The Hindu can derive no such strength. He cannot feel assured that his fellows will come to help, which will come to his help. Being one and fated to be alone, he remains powerless, develops timidity and cowardice. In a fight, surrenders or runs away. The Sikh as well as the Muslim stands fearless and gives battle because he knows that though one, he will not be alone. The presence of these beliefs in the one helps him to hold out, and the absence of it in the another makes man to give way. If pursue this matter further and ask what is it that enables the Sikh and the Mohammedans to help to feel so assured, and why is the Hindu feel with such despair in the matter of help and assistance, you will find that the reasons for this difference lie in the difference in their associated mode of living. The associated mode of life practiced by the Sikhs and the Mohammedans produce fellow feeling. The associated mode of life of the Hindus does not. Among Sikhs and Muslims there is a social cement which make them bhais. Among Hindus there is no such cement, and one Hindu does not regard another Hindu as his bhais. This explains why a Sikh says and feels that one Sikh or one Khalsa is equal to a Sawa Lakh men. This explains why one Mohammedan is equal to a crowd of Hindus. This difference is undoubtedly a difference due to a caste. So long as caste remains, there will be a no Sanghatan, and so long as there is no Sanghatan, the Hindu will remain weak and meek. The Hindus claim to be a very tolerant person, in fact very tolerant people. In my opinion, this is a mistake. On many occasions they can be intolerant, and if on some occasions they are tolerant, that is because they are too weak to oppose or too indifferent to oppose. This indifference of the Hindus has become so much a part of their nature that the Hindu will quite meekly tolerate an insult as well as a wrong. You see amongst them, to use the words of Morris, the great reading down the great reading down the little, the strong hitting down the weak, cruel man fearing not, kind men daring not, and wise men caring not. With the Hindu gods all forbearing, it is not difficult to imagine the pitiable conditions of the wrong and the oppressed among the Hindus. Indifferentiation, indifferentiation is the worst kind of disease that can infect a people. Why is the Hindus so indifferent? In my opinion, this indifferentism is the result of the caste system, which has made Sangathan and cooperation even for a good cause impossible. 12th, the assertions by the individual of his own opinions and beliefs, his own independence and the interest as over against group standards, group authorities and group interest is the beginning of all reform. But whether the reform will continue depends upon what scopes the group efforts in fact the group affords for such individuals assertion. If the group is tolerant and fair-minded in dealing with such individuals, they will continue to assert in the end and in the end succeed in converting their fellows. On the other hand, if the group is intolerant and does not bother about the means it adopts to stifle such individuals, they will perish and the reform will die out. New a caste has an unquestioned right to excommunicate any man who is guilty of breaking the rules of the caste, and when it is realized that excommunication involves a complete seizure of social intercourse, it will be agreed that as a form of punishment there is really little to choose between the excommunication and death. No wonder individual Hindus have not had the courage to assert their independence by breaking the barriers of the caste. It is true that the man cannot get on with his fellows, but it is also true that he cannot do without them. He would like to have the society of his fellows on his terms. If he cannot get it on his terms, then he will be ready to have it on any terms, even amounting to complete surrender. This is because he cannot do without society. A caste is ever ready to take advantage of the helplessness of a man and insists upon complete conformity to its codes in letter and in spirit. A caste can easily organize itself into a conspiracy to make the life of a reformer a hell. And if a conspiracy is a crime, I do not understand why such a nefarious act as an attempt to excommunicate a person for daring or act, in fact to act contrary to the rules of caste, should not be made an offensive punishable in law. But as it is, even law gives each caste an autonomy to regulate its membership and punish the dissenters with excommunication. This caste in the hands of the Orthodox has been a powerful weapon for persecuting the reforms and for killing all reforms.